session of our What's Next for Real Estate and the Life Experience webinar series. Thank you for joining us. I'm Thede Wright Chappelle, and I serve as Director of the Commercial PACE program in Utah. I will be moderating this session today. For those of you who may not be as familiar with the Counselors of Real Estate is a distinguished international group of accomplished leaders within the real estate profession. Experienced, innovative, and credentialed problem solvers, the Counselors practice in 20 countries and offer expertise in more than 50 real estate disciplines across all asset types and classes. This webinar series represents the very essence of the compelling thought leadership for which the Counselors of Real Estate are known. To learn more about the organization and its 1,000+ CRE professionals, please visit CRE.org. Attendees today will be muted during the conversation. However, you're encouraged to utilize the Q&A feature should you wish to submit a question. Your participation is welcomed and we'll answer as many questions as time allows. Today, we are very pleased to hear from Amy Erickson and Jack Davis as we have an in-depth and hopefully thought-provoking conversation about how environmental, social, and governance policies are no longer an emerging trend, but critical components of a successful real estate investment strategy going forward. Amy is an industry expert in real estate technology, green strategies, and smart cities. She leads Avison Young's global investment management practice, which is active across all major sectors and select specialty property types in North America and Europe. Prior to joining Avison Young, Amy was CEO of IGRI, a development and investment firm that built the first LEED certified projects across Canada in the mid-2000s. A graduate of MIT in city planning and real estate development, Amy serves as an educational counselor for MIT and sits on the Ontario board of the Nature Conservancy of Canada. Amy is a member of Avison Young's executive committee. She is originally from Spokane, Washington, but now resides in Toronto. Jack Davis is a managing director of Retech Advisors. Jack has over 25 years experience in development, engineering, and the pursuit of sustainable, high-performing real estate. Jack leads Retech's ESG consulting practice, assisting clients with strategy development, program design, marketing, and communications, and the successful execution of initiatives that reduce risk and complement investment strategies. Jack's team supports over 20 institutional investors, investment managers, REITs, and leading real estate investment firms, representing over $100 billion in assets under management. Welcome, Amy and Jack. We will begin with opening remarks from each of our speakers on ESG and how these policies are impacting their practices and how they envision them impacting the real estate industry going forward. Amy, let's start with you.
Great, thanks for that great introduction. I actually have been very pleasantly surprised with how ESG has fared through COVID, because usually when you have a recession, people pull back on things that they view to be optional. But I think that global pandemic certainly focused people's attention in the real estate industry early days on how healthy our buildings are and what we could do immediately to ensure their improved health and safety. In the middle of the summer, the Healthy Building Institute, the Well Institute, and the World GBC combined forces to put together a uniform protocol for building better places that incorporated a lot of the early work that the GBCs had been doing on LEED and other certification attributes with WELL, built an intersection for that, and rolled that out through the fall. And take-up's been just terrific. We co-sponsored that effort, and we're extremely pleased with how widespread the take-up has been. I think as the summer progressed and we saw the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, we've seen a real increase in focus around diversity and inclusion and social equity, And the question was, how durable would those interests remain? And I think that it's looking pretty good. I think that there's been a real improvement in commitments. And I've seen an awful lot of our clients and customers and suppliers adopting their own goals around these topics. And as an organization, a real estate organization, we actually made a commitment to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and became a signatory to PRI. So in my day job, it's now a big centerpiece of how we're approaching the investment management business on behalf of our clients.
Awesome. Jack?
Wow, I totally agree with Amy. It's been a interesting trend to see how COVID has added gasoline to the fire of ESG. And I would say the previous fire was the Trump administration here in North America, and how ESG almost accelerated through that 4-year period. So we're kind of hitting two different inflection points with interest around the world on ESG. And it's we're getting clients come to us almost daily trying to get a start on what they should do and how they should respond and what this actually all means, because ESG, as we all know, is a huge topic area that has 100 different types of subject matters underneath it. And so it's really driving a lot of conversations about what is material to real estate investment, which parts or portions of ESG make the most sense for each individual firm, and how do you sort through that and make a difference. We have a whole presentation on what are the underlying drivers of some of this, and it's things like technology disruption, demographic shifts that are happening, and who's making decisions about what money is getting invested in. Climate change is another driver for sure. So there's a lot of things we can talk about that we're observing from our practice.
So, and this is really kind of for both of you. I'll start back again with Amy, but in terms of the change in the types of services or the criteria that you're looking at for different types of investors, how do you see ESG playing, those considerations playing into their strategies for the future?
Well, certainly the pensions in Canada have been very active on this front, in some cases for as long as 3 decades. And so what we're seeing, even the smaller pensions are now building their own sustainability databases so that they can level set their managers against one another, and then they can drive their goals down into the people actually executing at the real estate level. So that's operationally how it's gaining traction. But I also think that the effort on the part of the certification bodies to try and get the standards in alignment with one another. I mean, one of the issues for advisors who are looking to implement best practices is that there's an alphabet soup of certification systems, and they aren't coordinated with one another. So you're having to resubmit the information in different formats over and over and over and over again. So if you want to do GRESB reporting, which is the Global Real Estate Sustainability benchmarking system, that's not coordinated with LEED in terms of how you present that information. And for a global manager like our organization, we're dealing with multiple building certification systems, from BOMA to LEED to BREEAM to DGNB, which is the equivalent in Germany. And so that means that it's very difficult to even get your own information into the same format so that you can benchmark across your own portfolio. So one of the really important developments, and the reason why I mentioned the Well Building Institute and the GBC coming together on this, is trying to make this information more compatible so it's portable, and managers can spend less time on data entry and more time on strategy.
Yeah, perfect. Great point. Jack?
Yeah, I think it's worth taking a step backwards and kind of just really looking at a high level what ESG really means. We use this term ESG, and it's kind of a catch-all bucket term that has emerged. I actually don't like the term personally that much. It's kind of goofy. You could say responsible investing, you could say triple bottom line, sustainability. Lots of terms have been merged together under this umbrella of ESG. But if you think about it, environmental, is pretty the most straightforward. It's energy efficiency, renewable energy, greenhouse gases, water conservation, those types of things that have a very direct relationship to most real estate properties. Social is, like was mentioned earlier, diversity, inclusion, engagement, transparency, community relations, more people-oriented aspects of the way these buildings are run and operated. And then, of course, the governance is actually, for a lot of our clients, the easiest part because they're registered fiduciaries or registered investment managers, and they have to have all the governance in place to even be registered. So you have, corporate ethics policies and transparency and disclosure requirements. So all of that gets mashed together in this ESG universe. And, I think we're seeing a lot of the investors have moved from asking their investment managers, yes, no, do you have an ESG policy or program, to now they're asking, well, what does that look like and how does it add value? And so the whole market is growing in its understanding and kind of going up the learning curve on moving from yes, no to how. And then from how, it's going to be much more who's doing it better, like Amy said, in the rankings of each other. It's also worth just noting some of the history of this. I think you can't discount the influence that GRESB has had on this whole topic. GRESB is, I guess, 8, 10, 12 years old at this point, started primarily kind of coming out of the Nordic and Dutch investors trying to get a handle on how they can evaluate their funds that they're investing in from this perspective. And the logarithmic growth of GRESB participation just continues daily. And it, it's not a perfect system, but it's a really influential system in the market for sure.
Yeah, I think I want to just add a point about GRESB, which is that it's actually a little more comprehensive than the building certification systems. It does inquire about all of the aspects that Jack was just mentioning, about governance, about your tenant engagement, how you're trying to bring your properties into relationship with the communities that you're in. So I think that that's right, that it has driven better comprehension of how to think about it holistically, and the participation rate is very strong.
On that note, I know for years the issue that I dealt with was, how do you find the value? How do you identify? How do you capture these different components? And so I would be interested to see, I know, Jack, you and I have talked about this, so I'll go back to you on metrics. When firms are assessing, have they succeeded? What are they looking at in terms of, all right, how do they get started and measure whether or not, what are their KPIs for success in these various kind of considerations?
Yeah, I think with the ESG at the real estate fund level and GRESB, we're kind of where we were with LEED about 15 years ago, where everybody was trying to establish the value of a LEED certification on an actual building. And a lot of research has gone, and I think there's still some research to be done there, but we know a lot more now today about the value of a LEED certification on a building than we did 10 years ago. GRESB, we're still just now getting into that, and I don't know of a lot of studies or analysis that have looked at like GRESB scores, for example, and attributed that to the performance. You could probably there's probably some research out there on the Odyssey Index and the performance of those firms and correlations with GRESB scores. I think the challenge is, again, ESG covers so much territory. Every one of our clients, we actually advise them to pick, the 4 or 5 aspects that are most aligned with their investment thesis. So you pick, greenhouse gas emissions and maybe diversity and inclusion and whatever, and focus on those and do a good job at those, because it reinforces your investment, that you're saying to your clients that you're going to add value to the real estate in this way. We have a client that really focuses on access to nature and open spaces. That's a great ESG strategy, and it's core to their identity as an investment manager. So it really works that way. A lot of our clients try to do too much too fast, and we're often having to pull them back and say, you can't do it all. And so what makes the most sense, and how do you prioritize, and which KPIs and data do you want to track so you can monitor progress and have a dialogue with your investors on that?
Great. Amy, comments? on metrics or?
GRASP has done some analysis of their submitters, and they have been able to document that certified buildings are fuller, they have higher tenant retention, and to some degree they have higher tenant satisfaction. There's no reason why in this day and age we know enough about these certifications that it doesn't need to really cost you any more money. But despite the fact that we have this evidence of some persistent outperformance, appraisers don't incorporate ESG characteristics into the underwriting. So if you're looking for valuation spreads and you're using appraisal data to justify that spread, you're looking in the wrong place, because until the appraisal industry has the ability to incorporate that data, we're always going to have a gap in the data sets. I mean, at present, they're outside of the United States. There's been widespread adoption of the FASB requirements from the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures for investors to start looking at quantifying the value at risk due to climate changes under various scenarios. And as that information, it's really just getting widespread in terms of its adoption, particularly in Europe and Canada. And as that information about future impairment gets translated and publicly translated, I think that the appraisal institutes will have to start incorporating that kind of information into the valuations.
I'm going to really behave myself and not go down that rabbit hole into valuation, which I very easily could. But I will agree with you completely. And I think the one aspect of that you hit on that today, even with the information we have now, which is a lot more than 15 years ago, the aspect of risk and the impact that could have on the rates that are utilized in valuation in of themselves could make a significant difference in recognizing, these different aspects, these different risk factors. I've gotten in a couple of questions. Let me ask you one of them, and this would be to both of you, either of you. I just got in a question about a term that someone said they had been hearing, which was ESG, with the first E being employee. Is that something that either of you have encountered?
I haven't heard it said that way, but employee is, or staff or members of the company, employment base altogether are always one of the stakeholder groups that we consider under the S.
Right.
If you think about for real estate, the S has several stakeholder groups that we want to kind of be cognizant of. You have investors and clients, you have the people in the buildings, the residents, the occupants, the tenants, you have the employees of the company itself. So that's, whether you're an investment manager, your asset managers and property managers. And then the community is the other part of the S, if you will. But, it's certainly an interesting way to frame it and put employees as its own kind of distinct aspect under that terminology.
Yeah, I'm in a different country, so maybe it's in different parlance up here, but when people are talking about a double E in this community, they're talking about social equity.
Right.
Yeah, which is increasingly becoming a dialogue in conjunction with diversity and inclusion, the social equity and the pay equity and the whole philosophy around equity in board representation and so on. So.
Well, it's very much, I think back over the years, and as long as we've been involved in this, at least I know Jack and I have for 15 plus, and Amy, you probably as well. The vernacular has changed, people, profit, planet, triple bottom line. It all does circle around, the same set of kind of considerations. I have another question that came in, and this one, was, in the long term, do you think there will be governmental fees associated with future mandates around these issues or penalty costs for non-compliance? Pretty broad question, but Jack, you looked at like you had something to say, so I'll start with you.
Well, yeah, there already are on one aspect of ESG in certain markets. So if you look at energy consumption at the building level, New York San Francisco, Seattle, a lot of markets have energy management regulations and penalties.
And let me wrap this in that real quick, because we got in one just now that also said, ask about New York City, since you mentioned that their new local 97,
Yep.
the Ultimate Mobilization Act, did they get it right? So
Wow. So let me come back to New York, but to answer the first question, there are some penalties on a specific slice of ESG already in place. Energy is actually one of the easiest ones to measure in this world, and it's still hard. So I would feel that it's going to be tougher for government agencies to put penalties in place for some of the more hard to measure things like the S and the G and other things. Not to say it won't happen. One thing to be watching is the European Green Taxonomy, which is happening in the EU. What they're doing is making you classify your product that you're going to market with in Europe across some ESG spectrums. And you have to fill out that this product adheres to this environmental standard or this social standard, et cetera. And you have to classify that so they can actually, it's kind of like a recipe code on the back of a cereal box. And you can look at it and go, okay, if I'm buying this, investing in this fund, it's checking these boxes on the ESG scorecard. Real quick, back to New York. New York is certainly one of the most aggressive protocols out there in terms of what they're trying to do with carbon, at least in the United States. Amy can speak to what's going on in Canada, and there's some really great stuff going on up there. Yeah. I don't know if I have an opinion on if New York's got it right or not. I think it's one of the most aggressive and one of the earliest ones. So it's certainly shaking up things and pushing the market forward. Time will tell if they've got it right, or if they have if there's other better approaches that other cities might come up with.
So Amy, I just wanted to ask you, because at some point I want you to describe what's going on with the cross-selling of energy in Canada, as opposed to how we are handling that here. But if you'll address this question, then we'll circle back to that.
Power outages in Texas, yeah.
Yes, that's exactly what prompted that. Yes.
Yeah, well, first to just add on to Jack's reference to the EU standards, they're also contemplating a regulation that would require all buildings to develop a plan to achieve net zero by 2050 in association with their Paris targets, and that report about physically what you have to do to the building to get there, against a backdrop of a national grid in each of the European countries, that all of those countries are nationally running their grid and moving it more and more and more into renewable energy footprint. So against that backdrop, it should be possible to actually build plans for each building. But once those are publicly disclosed, they'll have a meaningful effect on the valuations in that market. And that's, I think, a significantly more aggressive regulatory approach than you see in New York City. In Canada, there are two parts to this. The first thing is that we have a carbon tax. It's a backdrop carbon tax. The provinces were given the opportunity to establish a cap and trade or carbon tax regime, but some kind of carbon pricing. And if we don't, then the federal carbon tax is applied on their behalf, part of the country's execution of its Paris targets. And so we're seeing it in surcharges on our electric bills, and it's becoming substantial, and Trudeau has committed to substantially increasing that rate over the next 5 to 10 years to $170 a ton from its current 20. So that will be very substantial. We're also seeing it showing up in our insurance costs. And the year-over-year insurance costs are increasing dramatically, and that has a cost effect. The benefit of having different systems for San Francisco, for Washington, D.C., for New York, and so on, is that we will be able to see how these experiments work and what approaches are more effective than others. So there's only 2 provinces in Canada that are led by conservative governments, and they both declined to impose a provincial tax. So they're in the federal system, but the other provinces all have their own experiments going. And the government of Canada has launched a third-party study to assess the effectiveness of those strategies. And to your question about the grid integration,
Right.
Canada is legally organized for the same reasons, very similarly to how the US is organized, where more power is at the state control than at the federal control over things such as zoning, such as power composition, such as how water gets distributed. I mean, the EPA was trying to solve that problem for interstate water bodies and air bodies and so on. But as a result, the grid is very balkanized, and you have some states that are way behind in terms of decarbonizing their grid, and you have some states like California and actually Texas who are quite far along in terms of integrating renewable content. In Canada, it works like it's every other province. So what you were referencing is, in order to avoid making it look like the federal government was reaching in and telling the provinces what to do, they launched an infrastructure program where they're building an integrated grid between pairs of provinces, which I think was actually quite ingenious. So they're connecting the grid between British Columbia and Alberta. Alberta has about 40% carbon-based fuel content to its grid, and British Columbia is 100% hydroelectric. And so the power costs in British Columbia are about 5 cents a kilowatt hour, and they're about 11 in Alberta. So as soon as they get that grid integrated, and consumers in Alberta have the opportunity to elect to get their hydroelectric from British Columbia, they'll do so for two reasons: just to do something on a personal level to reduce their footprint, and secondly, to slash their electric bills in half. And you see, they did it for Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and they did it for Quebec and Ontario. And today, Quebec sells more power to the northeastern United States than it uses in Quebec, and it is not permitted to sell that power to Ontario, despite the fact that we have a 40% carbon-based grid. So just little steps like that can help minimize large-scale power outages like they're having in Texas and Oklahoma as we speak, while so improving the resilience of the system, while also rewarding those power systems that have been the most progressive in terms of integration of renewables.
Excellent. So I have a question which is somewhat one that we addressed a few moments ago, but let me read it to you and I'll get your input. It's because, you know, I wonder about the practical application. How do we practically apply these principles? And the question reads, given the wide range of topics covered under ESG, how do you anticipate investors approaching the topic? Will it be a binary check if a particular company or investment is good in any one ESG area, or will it be something that grades the larger range and depth of effect on the various ESG categories? So as you know, both of you who advise investors, how would you see this playing out over time? Amy, I'll go back to you.
Well,
first.
that's what the benchmarking is for, is to assess the performance of one manager against another. And as the information becomes more publicly disclosed about the carbon footprint of our investments and their climate risks, that will get incorporated into the valuations, right. And then you'll see the performance really spreading. But they already have several benchmarking systems. SASB is probably the one that is best known, although the Carbon Disclosure Project would be another, or GRI. There's a laundry list of those. Right. And those associations score you in terms of the authenticity and teeth of your ESG strategies. Not just do you have one that you put on your website, but how are you implementing it? As Jack said earlier, what are your KPIs and how are you reporting out about your progress to achieve those goals, and how does that compare to your peer group? Those systems are available today. It's another whole protocol that is not, they're not aligned with each other.
Right.
And they're not
Right.
currently aligned with GRESB. So, but GRESB itself awards green stars for the top performers, and they rank order you against your peer manager set.
And just a quick follow-up. Are you seeing, like, I know that from a valuation perspective, anytime, investors show preference for a certain, um, institution, or I know for years it was, as I think Jack mentioned, what's the value of a LEED certification? Are you seeing the investment community per se adopt these types of criteria when they're looking at where they want to put their money, or what they want to divest themselves of?
Did you want me to field that question?
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
And then I'm going to go to Jack and let.
Yeah, I think it's all over the map.
Okay.
You most definitely see it among the Canadian institutions.
Mhm.
It's absolute table stakes that you have those certification skills in-house, that you have a demonstrated track record of achievement, and that you are doing GRESB reporting. It is hit or miss in the United States. You'll find the more progressive states, like the northeastern states and California, have it as a fixed criteria in terms of manager selection, and then it's hit or miss for the rest of the country.
Jack, to you.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, related to these scoring systems like GRESB and how will investors use these tools, I kind of view it, your GRESB score or your other kind of benchmark score is the start of the conversation, not the end of the conversation. It's meant, to me, the best value in these benchmarks are to facilitate a dialogue between the investment manager and their clients, the investors, to understand, okay, why did we score the way we did? What are we focusing on? And, because GRESB, for example, has 15 or so sub-scores underneath the top score. So you can actually do well in certain aspects intentionally, because that's part of what your investment thesis is all about. And that's the story you want to tell to your clients and say, here's what we're doing. We're focusing on these aspects. While our top score may not be the highest in the peer group, we are doing well in these other ones because that's what we're focusing on. So the dialogue is important, because these benchmarks just tell you a little bit, and there's some structural issues that certain investors have headwinds against, because if you're investing in secondary markets with smaller buildings and different types of property types that are being compared to another investor who has West Coast Class A office buildings, there's just different things you can actually operationally do in those building types and markets that may or may not, in that particular scoring methodology, help you. So the score is just a conversation starter from where I sit.
Right. So I did get a question or a comment that of concern to Amy's point about there being so many different, systems or rating systems or criteria that like LEED, people became concerned about, well, how expensive will it be to meet these criteria? Is this going to deter adoption of some of these practices, or in fact, will moving more towards these types of considerations add value overall? So Jack, I'll start with you this time.
Yeah, it's very easy to get reporting fatigue and to try and do all of these different systems. So I think it's important to, number one, make a conscious decisions on which ones are participating and why. If you're going to participate in UN Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, that's fine. But decide that you're going to do that and know why you're going to do that. If you're going to report on GRESB, decide you're going to do that and know why you're going to do that. Because GRESB actually has a different reporting boundary than some of these other ones. GRESB is a scoring system on an investment fund or a REIT, whereas let's say PRI is a scoring system on a company, an investment manager of sorts, an asset manager. So they have different boundaries, they have different histories about why they were developed and what their intent was, and they tell you different things. So we go through with our clients a lot of discussions about which system do you want to participate in? Because transparency is good. We think you should participate in something, but don't try to hit every single one of them unless you're intentionally deciding to do that and they actually tell the story that or show the ESG strategy at work.
Amy?
Well, there's the issue of where do you begin, and I think that if you don't begin, you, in some ways, I guess there's a positive and a negative to that, because what is the industry standard is moving. So you can pick. I mean, for many years, many people went to BOMA Best instead of to LEED because they determined that it was less difficult to achieve, especially on existing buildings, because you don't have background information on where the materials came from, for example. And the same is true when you're looking at Fitwel and Well. They have different attributes to them. I agree with Jack's point that you need to first decide what it is you're trying to achieve. And usually you do that in consultation with the end owners, because some pensions are keen to have real estate provide steady income. Others are trying to achieve growth targets. And so some things are just more aligned with your client's objectives than others. So that is a helpful way of determining which direction you want to head.
And there could be a sequencing too. Sometimes it's easier to start with one of these systems and then move on to a more advanced system. GRES, in terms of level of effort, is an order of magnitude more difficult than something like PRI, which is fine. They measure different things and they are different systems. Sometimes we advise people to kind of like walk before you run, start here with something you can manage, and then grow into some of the more advanced systems.
Yeah, we have been using that acronym PRI. It stands for Principles of Responsible Investment. Yep. It's another UN sponsored platform that is benchmarking across the investment management industry largely, although there are a number of corporate signatories to the PRI too.
So I have another question that came in, and this gets back to kind of my, oops, sorry about that, to my issue of practical application, and that is, are potential tenants, have you been in a situation where they add this discussion to their lease negotiations? Is it part of, what you're hearing in those types of conversations? Jack, I'll start with you.
Yeah, our clients report, I think also, like Amy said, it's all over the map. It depends on the tenant and the sophistication of the tenant. I think a lot of the larger Fortune 500 company and tech tenants, especially knowledge worker based tenants, really do have their own environmental goals and ESG goals that they want to adhere to. So they very much want to ideally partner with their landlords to advance these types of initiatives at the property level. The implementation is tough though, because you're talking all of a sudden you're breaking it apart into 100 buildings and 500 tenants, and one particular tenant may only have leasing 2 spaces in your portfolio, and so economies of scale are tough to gravitate to. But yeah, I think those discussions are happening here and there, not in a uniform way, I would say.
Yeah, I would say that we work in a lot of different markets, and right. it would be it's becoming table stakes in the UK. In fact, in the UK last year, JLL made a net zero commitment. We did as well. And they were moving their corporate headquarters in London, which is a couple of 100,000 square feet, and it's not a small requirement. Yeah. And they put the RFP out asking, but by 4 or 5 years in advance, for someone to construct them a net zero building, because there aren't any currently in London, and they got no responses, zero. So right. There's an example of, you would think that would be a household name kind of a signature tenant, and people just weren't prepared to figure out what that would entail. Now in Canada, there are already 40 or 50 net zero certified buildings that have been constructed. The Canada Green Build Council took that on as a leadership matter for the World GBC, and they put competition out, and they facilitated technical assistance for the delivery of buildings in every property type in every climate zone of Canada to prove that it could be done. And it's done differently in different locations depending on the input feed from the grid. Like, it's pretty easy to do in British Columbia, Seattle, California, where the weather's very mild and the grids are very green. It's very difficult to do in places like Toronto, where I already mentioned the grid is not very green and the densities are so great that you have to work with a whole ladder of alternative strategies, from renewable energy credits to carbon offsets and so on.
I think, carbon neutrality and net zero is kind of PhD level stuff at this point for a lot of the marketplace. Where you do see a lot more activity is simply just green certifications and tenants asking for that. It may not be the criteria that wins them the lease or not, but it's one of the things they usually put on a RFP.
Yeah, so we see it showing up in the tenant RFPs from the banks, the insurance industry. They're doing TCFD reporting. They typically have a very rigorous, responsible investment policy.
And will you explain what that is, please? That type of reporting, just in case our audience isn't familiar.
Which one?
TCFD.
TCFD is I mentioned this a little bit earlier, the FASB, so the Financial Stability Board, put together a task force. The TC stands for, or TFCD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and that relates to actually these risks and these costs on your balance sheet and disclosing them to investors. And that standard has been adopted in the EU and the UK. It has not been adopted by the government of Canada, but the government of Canada is getting there indirectly. If you took any assistance at all of any kind, loans, grants, furlough assistance, you name it, from the government of Canada, you had to sign a commitment to become a TCFD compliant reporter. And that task force was led by Michael Bloomberg and Mark Carney. Mark Carney being the former head of the Bank of England, and prior to that, the former chair of the Bank of Canada. So that the adoption is quite steep in the rest of the developed world. And you see that, Jack mentioned the technology companies. In the last year or two, we've done a lot of tech leasing here. About 1 million feet to Microsoft, about 1.5 million to Amazon, for example. And it was a key component of both of those RFPs. And Amazon went into a net zero building, and Microsoft went into a LEED Platinum plus new construction towers. So that you're seeing, and those are big requirements, right? So they are able to move the market to where they want to be. But Microsoft has a net negative commitment. They've committed to offsetting their carbon footprint from the inception of the company. So they're on an extremely aggressive path. We bid to represent them in Europe, where it was front and center of their requirements there too. So it's definitely coming, but it's those leading edge, financially sophisticated companies that are leading the charge.
Well, those are also the credit-worthy tenants that everybody wants too. So you should be careful. Thede, I think I want to echo the importance of TCFD. It is a topic that's emerged in the past 12 to 18 months very rapidly among our clients, and people are trying to understand how they get started and what does this mean and how do you actually evaluate a asset from a climate risk perspective. TCFD has some kind of ingredients that they expect to see in that reporting, but it's not very prescriptive on how you do it. So it's another theme I expect in the ESG universe to really grow over the next year.
We just got a question that really kind of dovetails into that, and that is, are you seeing ESG risk get priced into acquisitions, dispositions, portfolio analysis? Jack, I'll start with you and then move to Amy. Good question. Yeah.
I think I know who asked that question, but anyway. So you possibly, yes. I think it's very early starting to on the risk side, especially on climate risk. We actually, for a number of our clients on the equity and debt side, are doing climate risk assessment reports for assets that they're underwriting. I don't have a lot of evidence yet that they're taking that and really put it into the pricing and underwriting on a very advanced level, but they are starting to look at that information and include it in the investment committee in discussions. I have another anecdotal story of a client who basically there was a conversation in the investment committee and somebody brought up, this was a property in Colorado, and somebody brought up water scarcity related to climate change. And it pretty much stumped that investment committee and the whole deal just stopped. And everybody had to like look at each other and go, well, how do we answer that? And so there's these kind of early questions starting to bubble up in these discussions. And I think there's some leaders out there. Amy, I'm sure you are pretty advanced on this, and others are just starting to figure out what questions to even ask.
Yeah, again, this is a situation where U.S. investors are not there, as best I can tell. I mean, it may be coming up indirectly because they're sitting down with their property insurers and saying, why are my premiums going up so rapidly? And you can see the answer in your own portfolio, which is that 40% of your assets are in hurricane exposed locations. And we have 5 superstorms just last year. So the damages are starting to add up, and you see that has an effect on valuations. And so it's sort of indirectly seeping into their mindset. But leading edge investors like the Dutch and the Nordics, even like Grosvenor and the Crown Estates, it's a front and center part of how they're thinking about it. You even have Saudi Aramco, who IPO'd their oil business and is busy diversifying as fast as they can. So, some of the world's biggest investors have made it a centerpiece in terms of strategic migration of their portfolio. So it's coming.
So have you seen any instances where investors are looking, or owners are looking at measuring productivity in buildings, or organizations that have adopted these guidelines? We just got that question asked. So I know that was kind of not the very first thing that happened with LEED, but are we that far along with ESG parameters or not?
Well, what comes to mind is tenant surveys, employee surveys, and the single largest variable in productivity is turnover. And to the extent that you can retain your staff and get the benefit of the training that you do, that's gonna move the needle more on productivity than pretty much any other measure. And so it's also been demonstrated that tenants and employees that get surveyed appreciate it
Right.
and feel appreciated. And so that, I think, that's all pretty squishy stuff, but that's how I would answer that question. And they do, GRESB, for example, does actually require you to disclose on frequency of that survey information.
Okay.
Yeah, I know some folks who have been researching this for years, and it's another example of where ESG and the sheer number of variables that we loop under that term kind of hurts us, because is the productivity due to access to natural light or indoor air quality?
Right.
You have to study those separately, and then or green space, or there's all these different things that actually lead to that productivity, and it's hard to really. I mean, you have to do basically 1,000 studies to kind of statistically prove each of those questions out. I will say also the productivity question has kind of gotten subsumed or overwhelmed by the whole health and wellness question because of COVID.
Right.
And, everybody kind of dropped what they're doing, and productivity is now, is it more productive? The question is more about, is it more productive in the office versus on Zoom calls? And the health and wellness and indoor air quality and making sure those buildings, when people are in the buildings, are healthy, that's kind of taken the center stage of everybody's focus.
So I just got in one, and I'll give this to both of you. A lot of these are along the same lines, but this one is, in terms of building assessments, how do you define the scope and what do you look for as you formulate an ESG plan for a
Mhm.
large multi-tenant office building or large mixed-use property? What do you recommend and what minimum standard should be benchmarked? Big question, but.
Well, I think that most people approach it from a market competitiveness vantage point. And if you're in a market like Toronto, where you are not a Class A building unless you have high levels of certification, you're aiming for a pretty high standard just to be middle of the market. If you're in a market, good example would be a very hot market, Nashville, doesn't have any certified buildings. There's one under construction by Brookfield right now, but it has no certified buildings. So what you would be looking for or focused on in that particular situation is how you can best control costs, because that will make you more competitive.
Yeah, I think there's two thoughts to that. I agree with Amy. You want to look at it from, again, I go back to the investment thesis. What is the development or purchase of that asset trying to do? Is it a core fund holding it? Is it are you renovating it? Or are you going to try to change the type of the building or the function of the building, or attract different class of clients? All those questions should drive what you then start diving in on in terms of the ESG factors. That being said, there are some core ones that I think are pretty almost foundational for most of this type of work, which is energy efficiency and carbon emissions, water in certain cases, and I would say renewable energy and how and where you're getting your energy. Those kind of are like the blocking and tackling of sustainability in real estate.
I will get, Jack, you got a shout out for mentioning water, because it's not that frequently addressed. So there you go.
Well, water is challenging because it's so cheap and it's hard to make it pay back on an ROI basis. We subsidize our water so much in this country, and I'm a former civil engineer, so water is kind of a hobby of mine. It's the risk of climate change is not priced into the way the water is distributed in this country.
Amy, any comments on that relative to the water and how that's managed in Canada versus the US?
Well, what ran into my mind is the Netherlands. And I attended the ULI conference in Amsterdam last January. It probably, in retrospect, wasn't the best idea, but we did a tour of the business park that's at the airport. And it's the first two phases were all data centers, and that's the home of the data center hub for the EU. And when we pulled up to the entry gate, it has a plaque on it that says elevation minus 23 meters. And the idea of putting a data center in an area that would go 30 or 60 feet underwater if the levees broke is just inconceivable. Like, they should be in Switzerland, okay? First of all, it's centrally located and it's out of harm's way there. So it's inescapable when you're in like Copenhagen or Stockholm or Amsterdam, how proactively they manage water for every which reason, but it's so pervasive, it's everywhere. And, Canada is sort of in that category. Canada has something like 45% of the world's fresh water. And so, again, water is almost free. And it's not, the big issues here are how to manage the annual increase in rain flows, because we are seeing a lot of river flooding, and the Great Lakes are sitting at capacity for like the last 5 years to try and reduce the amount of flooding in Quebec, because it all goes out to the Atlantic through the St. Lawrence. And so we're starting to see more interest. Obviously, if you live in Colorado, you're concerned about desertification, but we've seen so much flooding in the likes of Houston, and whole sections of New Orleans are dropping into the ocean.
Yeah.
So I do, and eventually they'll tune into this station in South Florida because of sea level rise. So.
All right, well, I'm going to do a final question to both of you, and then we'll wrap up in a couple of minutes. I just got an interesting question, and it is an opinion, but based on the investors that you're working with, the different groups, the question was, would certifications help facilitate or encourage workers to return to existing workspaces and feel safe doing so? So, Jack, I'll start with you and then end up with Amy.
It's a good question. I have a little bit of skepticism if that certification, if you're talking about COVID in particular, can actually be achieved that would be scientifically based enough to actually prove out the safety of that building. Just because COVID is still so, there's so much we don't understand yet about that particular virus and how it transmits and what technologies in the building can, inhibit or prevent that kind of stuff. So if a certification could be, scientifically grounded in a way that would demonstrate that, sure. But I think by the time that happens, other factors are going to determine how we return our buildings, like employers just saying, go to work.
All right.
Interesting. I think that I think that how a building is managed makes a big difference. And we happen to be, my office here in Toronto is in a building that is managed by the real estate arm of the British Columbia Investment Management Authority, and they're extremely green and proactive about everything. And the level of communications that they have been sending out to everybody who has an office in that building, I mean, literally 3 or 4 times a week, about all of the different protocols they're putting in place. At the end of the day, COVID is a behavioral issue for people. And how are you enforcing mask protocols? How are you enforcing your cleaning regimes? How rigorously are you communicating on that? In Toronto, downtown anyway, most of the buildings are connected by an underground city. And this is true in many of the Canadian cities because of the weather. And so basically all the building owners, and we formed a committee to actually address this, had to agree on protocols because all the buildings are connected.
Right.
So some landlords have communicated far more effectively than others to their tenants about how extensive those protocols are and that they apply for the whole downtown area. It's been more of an issue in terms of getting people to go into downtown, and here the attendance downtown's been at about 10%, and in the suburbs about 30%. And the difference is that it's almost impossible to get into downtown where not using transit. There's no roads. So and I think that is a bigger impediment than people worried about how their buildings are being managed. Personal opinion.
Yeah,
Jack,
just speculating here. I think you may actually be better off certifying the people in the building versus the building itself, with vaccine passports and only letting people in the building. But yeah, big question. I'm afraid we can't prognosticate too much.
Well, so thank you both. Can you, each of you, give me a 30 to 45 second wrap up on what you would like to leave the audience with? Jack, I'll start with you and end with Amy.
Sure. Don't get overwhelmed. It can easily be overwhelmed. This topic of ESG. Look at what your peers are doing. Talk with your, thankfully, those of us who work in sustainability and ESG and real estate are pretty open to sharing best practices with each other. So talk with each other and, get started and start small and build over time. This is a marathon, not a sprint. And, we all want to do good together and solve these problems together, but, it takes cooperation. So thanks for the opportunity to be part of this panel. It's great.
Sure. Amy?
Yeah, well, the three of us have a history of the Responsible Investment Council for ULI. And so we've been part of small community that have been jumping up and down on these subjects for decades. And
Yes.
it feels different now. It just does. It
Yeah.
feels like we're finally able to make some traction and progress. It's not going to be continuous. It's not going to be without its setbacks, and it's more challenging in balkanized environment like our provincial system and your state system than it is for those European countries that have a much more federalist view on things, so that they're able to coordinate everybody in the same direction faster. But it doesn't mean that we won't get there better and maybe even sooner, because the competitive market and all of these experiments that are being undertaken will have results and they'll be communicated. And I do think that we've turned the corner on maybe not on climate denialism, but in terms of the business community recognizing that climate risks are investment risks, and we need to understand the problem better and be more proactive in terms of leading our way out of this.
Thank you. So thank you both, Amy and Jack. And as your discussions reflected, the ESG policies do now represent a more important component of prudent risk mitigation strategy that are necessary for long-term value enhancement. Just as a point of information, on-demand recordings are available for our What's Next sessions, including today's. And I would encourage everyone to visit cre.org/webinars for information on other topical and thought-provoking programs. In particular, look out for a special presentation in partnership with the International Council of Shopping Centers. It's coming on March 17th, pardon me. So until then, on behalf of the Counselors of Real Estate, thank you for attending this session of our What's Next for Real Estate and Life Experience webinar series. Thank you and good day.